before he went into the Army, he'd gotten married back in 1942, specifically on May the 23rd, to Rosalind Goldstein. This was a marriage that actually lasted into his death. He was married to her for a long time. We'll get into Roz, as she was called, not just by him, but by pretty much everybody later. She plays a very important role in his life, crucial even. Also, when he was drafted, or right before he was drafted, he was asked by Timely Comics to please draw a whole bunch of extra issues of Captain America, because they figured he was going to be drafted. And yeah, the comic needed to keep running. He was paid in advance for all that good stuff, and that was very helpful. In the meantime, he did go to the Army. He went to Camp Stewart, in fact, for his basic training. Drafted on the 7th of June, in 1943. He did his basic, and then he was deployed to Omaha Beach in Normandy. Yeah, on the 23rd of August, 1944. That was 2.5 months after D-Day. So, dangerous, not D-Day dangerous. Still, yeah, talk about avoiding that bullet, right? Pretty soon, his superiors learned that he was a comic book artist, and using that to the best of their abilities, they said, okay, well, here's the deal. You're going to go into different towns, all right, kind of like as part of a scouting party, and you're going to draw what that town looks like so that you can come back and give us maps. And wow, what a dangerous job. But, you know, he did what he had to do. So that's what he did. His war stories are pretty horrific. If you ever get around to listening to them on YouTube, really, you know, scary stuff, messed up stuff, stuff that will change a human being. You know, it's one thing being a tough guy on the mean streets of New York. It's another thing to actually go to war and be shot at and have to shoot at other people and know that the police are absolutely never going to come and break things up. So, anyway, he was sent home to, well, not home, but he was sent to North Carolina to finish out his last 6 months of service because he'd actually developed frostbite out in the field. It was in his feet, but fortunately nothing had to be amputated. Now, after the war, Captain America really wasn't needed. There was the whole McCarthyism thing going on and a whole bunch of crazy things. So eventually Joe Simon was able to partner up with him again and went on and joined Harvey Comics. There he was able to explore different mediums of the art. Now, it's kind of important to mention that Joe Simon, while he did write a little bit, he drew a little bit, he did, you know, what was necessary. But for the most part, while Jack came from really poor beginnings, not college educated, nothing, Joe Simon came from pretty much the exact opposite side of the tracks. He was college educated, he was very intelligent, academic point. He was a tall guy, he was pretty affluent, he was a good-looking guy who he had that it factor that allowed him to schmooze and talk to people and whatnot. So, while Jack was doing the nitty-gritty, for the most part, that wouldn't have sold the way that it could have sold if it wasn't for Joe Simon. So they were both actual partners. They both kind of fulfilled their roles as was necessary. Anyway, at Harvey Comics, Jack started drawing things like Western Boys Ranch and Boy Explorer comics. These were pretty important to the genre because superheroes just weren't cutting it anymore. I mean, realistically, if you are able to look back on all those old Superman, first off, like the golden age was not necessarily over, but yeah, kind of over in the 50s. Nobody needed the superheroes to be superheroes, so to speak, anymore. Most of the superheroes were gone, man. Think about Green Lantern. Even when he came back in the Silver Age, it wasn't the same Green Lantern, right? Same thing with so many other heroes. Hawkman's a little different. He's complicated. But at the end of the day, even in the Superman comics, because Superman was going to survive, Wonder Woman was going to survive, Batman was going to survive, but just not in the same fashion. Superman, in his stories, the comics would usually begin with him returning from space, right? From some mission, doing whatever, saving the world, the galaxy, the universe, whatever, right? The comics would actually be themselves about his interactions with Lois Lane and things like that, right? So he was still a superhero, but that was kind of, for the most part, off-panel. There wasn't anything particularly super about Superman, not in the regular sense of things. So Joe made money by doing Western comics. He did crime comics, real police stories, and war comics by actual veterans. That was a selling point that Joe Simon used. Jack Kirby is, do I want to say solely responsible? In a sense, yes, I do. All right? He was almost solely responsible for starting the romance stories. All right? He made this comic called Young Romance. Now, today, you and I, right, let's be realistic. We're going to look at this and we're going to say, yeah, they were romance comics. I mean, come on. Yeah, who cares? Who cares, right? But back then, they sold. Now, before they actually sold, Joe Simon went up to the publishers, the producers, the bosses, the figureheads of Harvey Comics. He went to them and he says, listen, here's the deal. We're going to do this comic book, all right? And here's some examples of what we're going to do. Now, if you want this, and you want us to do it, here's what we want. We want 50% of the profits, all right? We're not going to ask for anything in advance, all right? As is usual, you know, we get in advance, and then we get paid per page done, and so on and so forth, whatever, right? No. We want 50% of the profits. That's what we want. Harvey Comics was willing to take that risk because, I mean, let's be realistic. They didn't know if it was going to sell in the first place. So Joe Simon actually got what was a doozy of a deal because Jack Kirby was able to write something and draw something that sold, and it sold great. In fact, when Young Romance #1 hit the newsstands, 92% of it, I believe, was actually sold. 92% of the initial run, the initial print. So, in all succeeding issues, Harvey Comics actually started to triple the yield just to make sure that enough of them would get out. These guys made, back in the 50s, essentially millions, right? Millions. It was enough that enough that Jack was able to get a house in Long Island, specifically Mineola, Long Island. He bought the house, I think, outright. Either way, he lived there for the next 20 years. And it was here that the dungeon was created, right? The dungeon was actually just about a 10 square foot area or so in the basement, right? There was no window, so no air source coming in except from the stairs, leading upstairs, but that was always closed. He would have the radio on in the background. He would have the TV on also in the background, just so there were different forms of noise, so he didn't have to hear. You know, he had 4 kids. I mean, give the guy some slack. You know, kids running around upstairs and whatnot. You need to focus on your work. He put on some distractions, right? I remember a story. His wife comes downstairs, or his kids come down. I think it was his kids. They're like, you know, you have the Spanish radio station on. You don't speak a word of Spanish. What are you doing? He's like, oh, whatever. I like the way it sounds. You know, the music or even just the talking. He just liked the way it sounded, and it was a way to just escape so that he could focus on what he was doing. Here's where Roz starts to play she's always played an important role in his life, but here's where particularly us fans would be interested. Imagine this. Imagine back then, back in the day, you're looking in the white pages and you look up Jack Kirby. Because why not? I mean, he's your favorite artist, and you specifically choose that I'm going to find artists. I'm going to read comics based on who my idols are in the comics, right? And they came along and they looked in the white pages and found Jack Kirby's address, phone number, and everything. So he would get phone calls all the time, and he would get people, fans coming over, you know, these kids coming over and wanting to hang out with Jack the King Kirby. And they would come over, and Roz, being a typical Jewish household, right? You're not going anywhere until you sit down and eat. And that's what she did. She actually would make food. She would make sandwiches and whatnot, make lunch for these kids, and they would have to sit down and eat before they could go downstairs and hang out with their hero, Jack Kirby, right? That's just amazing. Could you imagine that today? If we were able to do something like that, forget about it. Yeah, I'd be the guy walking in. Can I see my favorite artist? And I'll take a, you know, salami, just something, right? But the idea is that she did this because everybody was welcome in her household, and everybody felt like they were at home. If the kids were all going into the pool that day, hey, hope you brought your swimwear, because guess what? Come on out and hang out with us in the pool. I mean, that's a beautiful thing, right? And she did more than that. I mean, she knew that Jack was pretty much in that single-minded determination sort of thing. I mean, pretty soon, all right, just to move this along with the comics, he eventually did go back to Timely Comics, which became Atlas Comics, which became Marvel Comics. And that was after about a 10-month, 13-month, whatever, a short hiatus where he was working freelance everywhere. And he'd be working in DC Comics, also Archie Comics, a bunch of different places. He worked on the Green Arrow for a while, actually switched things up, and instead of being Batman-esque, he made him more of a sci-fi kind of hero. But whatever works, right? Is the idea to shake things up. The point is, when he did eventually go back to Marvel Comics, and fans like crazy would start coming over because of his work on the Fantastic Four, all right, back in 1961, this guy, he would actually be able to churn out 7 to 8 pages a day. And it was kind of necessary because he did have payments. He had a family that he had to take care of. And at the end of the day, Marvel wasn't able to pay that much money. They were not necessarily the new guys on the block, but they didn't have those powerhouse hits like DC Comics had. I think they were national at the time. Even Fawcett Comics with Shazam, Captain Marvel, right? They had these powerhouses and heavy hitters, and Marvel simply didn't have that. All they had were like the Tales to Astonish and Amazing Adventures and Journey into Mystery, all these comics that at the time didn't have superheroes. What they had were their crime stories, their real police stories. They were claimed to be real police stories, who knows, and things like that. And eventually the drive-in theater style monster sci-fi movie, fantasy type things. That's actually where Groot was first made. I talked about that in another video. That's where the Hulk videos, in fact. That's where Fin Fang Foom was made. Gratu was made. All these old school monster villains were made that were changed a little bit over time. They were revamped a little bit. You know, you find out what sticks on the wall and you throw a couple more things made of the same or similar mixture, right? But that's what Jack Kirby was able to do. He was able to invent all of these insane, you know, stories and whatnot. And eventually, when the idea was come to press about the Fantastic Four, which we'll get into more later. Actually, I think I'm going to do that in a different video because that's actually a pretty big deal, all right? And it deserves a lot more than just a quick mention. Anyway, eventually when Captain America would be brought back and when Iron Man was created and all these different characters were created, Jack, who was a big part of that creation, Jack and Stan Lee, when all these characters were created, more and more fans were being generated, and Marvel was actually able to finally compete with the big time, which was DC at the time, which actually distributed the Marvel comics at the time. So Marvel had to be prepared because they knew that DC was just going to drop them once they started actually competing with them because they weren't competition at the time. Anyway, so since Marvel wasn't able to pay that much in the beginning until they were able to start getting some money, churning out some sales, Your average comic book artist was able to put out about 2 comic book pages per day, and you got paid per page that you did when you were an artist. All right. So Jack was able to do, for pretty much the majority of his life, 5 pages per day. But in those beginning years, he had to put out about 8 per day on average because he needed the money for his family. And Roz knew this. She understood this. And they're a cohesive family. They're a unit. And she knew that he couldn't be distracted with these other things. If you know some of the stories of Albert Einstein, yes, I'm making this comparison, he was so brilliant. He didn't want to waste his time with thinking about little things like, what am I going to wear? All right. And if I could throw myself into the mix a little bit, right? I wear a pair of jeans and I wear a comic book t-shirt. And I have a whole bunch of comic book t-shirts and they match with all of my jeans. So you know what? I don't have to think about stuff like that. I just simply wear clothes. I pull them out of the closet. I put them on and I can go on about my day working and making cool videos for you guys too, eh? But taking myself outside of the mix and back to Albert Einstein and Jack Kirby, genius comes in many different forms. It's easy to say that Albert Einstein and Richard Feynman and people like that are geniuses, right? But would you deny that William Shakespeare is a genius? And on the exact same premise, I'm going to say that Jack Kirby was absolutely a genius. Absolutely. Here's a man who was in his medium and he was churning out these comic pages like crazy. He couldn't spend his time thinking about what am I going to wear, so Roz would even lay out his clothes for him. Roz would come downstairs and see that 3 o'clock in the morning, Jack is still working and say, you know, Jack, come to bed. Come on, it's time to come to bed. You got to get some sleep, all right? You're not a robot. He'd go upstairs, he'd go to sleep. She would wake up later in the morning and see, oh, he's already back downstairs working. But, you know, make him food, bring her down, don't disturb him. You know, but at the same time, he wasn't really easy to disturb. You could talk to him and he could talk back to you while he'd still be working. And that's the kind of thing that Roz did for him. She would answer the phone all the time, right? She kind of had to answer the phone because Jack was such a nice guy and didn't think about the bad things that could happen by answering the phone, like some scam artist, you know, calling in, you know, give away your bank information and things like that. She would sometimes take the phone from him and say, who is this? You're a scam. Go away. You know, hang up. I think a lot of kids today won't understand the concept of this is how you hang up a phone, not push a button. And anyway, so the idea here is that she had to do a lot for him, a whole lot for him. And he just stayed down there and he worked in his field and he just produced comic books all the time. And he was a huge, gigantic part of the creative process. I know that he's just written down as the artist a lot of times. Stan Lee did a lot as far as the creative process. Just clear cut, he did. But it can't be denied how much that Jack Kirby did also. I mean, a lot of times he'd be given a script, and sometimes he'd even throw the script out the window, you know, proverbially. He would just, whatever, and he would just start doing his own thing. He'd read whatever, he'd be like, okay, I got a better idea than this, and he would start doing his own thing. Of course, by the time he turned over those issues, he never read the final product. So when Stan would come along and later on other writers would come along and write in whatever was supposed to be written in, a lot of times they would look at what Jack wrote and say, yeah, I don't want to do that. So instead they would put in their own thing. So that's the sort of thing that would have to go on in the Kirby household. He didn't really do too much outside of draw, right? Eventually he even had to stop driving because he'd be so focused all the time on what he was doing that sometimes he would actually pull up on the curb, drive off the road a little bit, sometimes more than a little bit, because he's too busy thinking about, oh, I've got this great idea, and completely forget what he was doing. So for the sake of safety of the family and other people's families too, and public property, he just stopped driving, and people had to start driving around because he was constantly thinking about what new thing he could do, what new thing he could draw, what new thing he could create. And that's, to me, that's mind-boggling. That somebody could be so focused on his love, on his art, his craft.